So we kind of divided up the lecture into two parts. The first part is we'll talk about the beginning of life issues, and William is going to talk about the end of life issues. Right. So I'm going to address the beginning of life issues. All right. So the moral issues related to the beginning of life are mostly decisions of the adults or parents concerning their children. There are three main questions. First one, whether and how to have children. Second one, whether and how not to have children. And third, what kind of children to have. The question concerning not to have children is related to contraception, abortion, and putting up children for adoption. It is also related to congenital disease and anomalies, whether deformed fetuses should be aborted. The question that concerns with having children, more broadly speaking, is concerned with the provisions and the environment suitable for the upbringing of children. And more specifically, for couples having difficulty bearing their own children, it is concerned with assisted reproductive technologies. And finally, the question about what kind of children to have leads to the issues of genetic screening of parents, prenatal screening of embryos and fetuses, and human trait enhancement, more commonly known as the designer baby. This presentation will only focus on assisted reproductive technologies, or ART in short form, assisted reproductive technologies. And specifically, I will approach the question, are Christians permitted to use ART at all? And if so, what kind? A couple of notes to begin. First, all beginning of life issues are related to one another. So while we think through one issue, we may have to address others. As we'll see later, the question of ART is related to contraception and adoption. And for certain ART methods, also related to the disposal of waste embryos, an issue linked with abortion. And secondly, the issue of ART has become much more complicated with the advent of modern medical technology. Most of the ART were not developed until the 20th century. So this is really a modern issue. And Scripture does not address it directly. We will need theology and doctrine to help us think through the question. So ART, in the broadest sense, means the use of technology to help a person or a couple to have biological children of their own. The different technologies roughly fall into three categories. The first is fertility drug, which is used in case of ovulation dysfunction. The drug helps the woman to ovulate, and the ovum produced will then be fertilized in normal sexual intercourse. The second is artificial insemination, where the sperm is transferred directly into the woman's oviduct without copulation. This method is usually used for couples having difficulty conceiving through natural means. Artificial insemination from husband, AIH, increases the chance of pregnancy through exact placement of sperm and timing of insemination. And when the sperm is donated by a male other than the husband, the technology is called artificial insemination from donor, AID. This can be used when the husband is sterile or for single females or same-sex couples to have children. The third category of ART involves the extraction of gametes, that is, ova and sperms, conduct the fertilization outside of the body, that is, in vitro. Let the fertilized embryo grow for several days to observe any anomaly. Then transfer the embryo into the woman's uterus, hoping for successful implantation and pregnancy. To increase the chance of successful pregnancy, usually several embryos are prepared, and only the best ones are used. This technology, commonly known as in vitro fertilization, IVF, vastly expands the different types of pregnancy possible. Now, fertilization, selection of embryo, and gestation are separated. Each process can then be manipulated individually. The sperm can come from the husband or a donor. So can the ovum. The embryo can be created by fertilization of an ovum with a sperm, but it can also be created by cloning. A couple can decide to have surrogate mother to carry the fetus that bears the genetic material. The sperms, ova, and embryos can be frozen before fertilization and implantation. And if this technology is perfected, a woman can extract her ova in her womb and have babies later in her life. Embryos can be tested for anomaly. but they can also be screened for characteristics such as sex and other human traits. And germline engineering can cure genetic diseases and improve on human traits. So therefore, IVF is an important step that makes designer babies and many other reproductive technologies possible. So that's an outline of what's going on and what's available in RVRT. When we turn to theology, the first thing to affirm is that children are gifts from God. To live is good, and bringing life into the world is also good. In the creation account, God commanded human beings to be fruitful and multiply. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel, Hannah the mother of Samuel, and even Zechariah and Elizabeth, the parents of John the Baptist, they all experienced infertility. Children were granted to them when they earnestly prayed to God. These narratives tell us that children are gifts of God. They also show us that the desire to have children is a part of human nature. The separation of Lot from Abraham and the rejection of Ishmael appear to affirm that only those children biologically related to both parents are the real children. And also the law of levirate marriage in the Old Testament. It mandates a man to marry the widow of his childless brother, and their firstborn son should be treated as the son of the deceased brother. Perhaps this is an ancient remedy to childlessness, and can be thought of as a form of assisted reproduction. Levirate marriage is strictly similar to artificial insemination by donor, where the donor is the brother's, but sexual intercourse is involved. Perhaps we can call it natural insemination from donor. Note that biological relationship is emphasized in levirate marriage. The heir of the deceased should not be an adopted son, but must be linked biologically as close as possible. With the imperative to have biological children trumping even marriage arrangements, the Old Testament seems to endorse using modern ART as long as biological linkage is maintained. It would appear that fertility drugs, artificial insemination, and IVF should be used as long as the gametes are from the parents. And in light of the practice of levirate marriage, perhaps the sperm of the father's brother or the ovum of the mother's sister can be used to conceive a child. But things look very different in the New Testament. The imperative to have one's own children is largely qualified after the time of Jesus. Jesus remained single throughout his life and never had his own biological children. He was the eschatological figure who showed us what it would be like in the future eschaton. In Matthew chapter 22, 30, verse 30, Jesus said, "In the resurrection, people will never marry, nor are given in marriage. Marriage and childbearing will cease in the resurrection. No more children will be born." He demonstrated this as eschatological ideal in his earthly life. In the Old Testament time, the hope for the Messiah meant that salvation would be in the future generations, mandating the perpetuation of biological lineage. But this hope has been fulfilled in Jesus. After all, the last couple in the biblical narrative, who was childless and later granted a child of their own, was Zechariah and Elizabeth, whose son John the Baptist represents the end of the Old Testament era of expectation. Now in the time of Christ, procreation predicated on biological birth is replaced by the spreading of the gospel, which brings about spiritual births. St. Augustine says that before Christ, it was a time for marrying. Since Christ, it has been a time for continence. Now that the child has been born, the birth of other children is not necessary. So the coming of Jesus removes the mandate to procreate, but Jesus did not abolish the creation order of marriage and procreation. Although Jesus himself never married or have children, he never exhorted his disciples to do the same. Jesus' suffering, resurrection, and exaltation did not abolish creation, but vindicated and fulfilled God's creation order. The created order of marriage is also vindicated in Christ. In Matthew chapter 19, Jesus discussed how the creation order is vindicated. He quoted the creation account in his debate with the Pharisees. He said, "At the beginning, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." So it is the joining together of the two that the created order of marriage is fulfilled. In the time of Christ, the created order of marriage points to the permanent and exclusiveness of covenanting partners, not to procreation. So in other words, marriage remains an order of creation on this side of eschaton. Christians can still marry in this time, in the end of times. But we have to bear witness to the fidelity and permanence of marriage. And we are not mandated to bear children. And after his debate with the Pharisees in the same chapter, Matthew chapter 19, Jesus discusses with his disciples about the eschatological ideal of singleness. He says that those who have made themselves eunuchs do it for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Those who maintain single are to serve the kingdom faithfully and exclusively. Therefore, they are also bound by a permanent and exclusive covenant with God. Although in the eschaton, marriage among persons will be abolished, marriage between Christ and church will take place. Therefore, Christ does not abolish the created order of marriage. He fulfills it by affirming its permanence and exclusiveness for both earthly and heavenly marriages. Therefore, for Christians today, marriage and singleness both serve as witnesses, the former to God's creation and the latter to the eschaton. But it is the covenantal fidelity and the permanence that holds together both witnesses. So we see that now the created order of marriage remains, but singleness becomes one legitimate option for Christians. Procreation is no longer a mandate. Before the advent of effective birth control methods, Christian couples continued to have children. People had little control over whether and how many children they have. Childbearing continued as a natural outcome of marriages, while childless couples could do little but to pray. The beginning of life moral debates were mostly concerned with the legitimacy of children and child rearing, education, and so on, not over whether to have children. But the modern moral debate over the beginning of life issues became important with the invention and popularization of modern medicine, such as contraceptives, abortion, and ART. Removal of the procreation mandate appears to mean that children are not necessary. So we are tempted to conclude that childless Christian couples should not resort to any means of ART. But this argument assumes that the eschatological ideal of singleness and thus childlessness trumps the creation order of marriage and procreation. We have to understand that the coming of Christ means that singleness and marriage are two equal witnesses. One should not trump the other. While childlessness is the natural outcome of singleness, procreation remains the natural outcome of marriage. Childlessness that is ordered to singleness should not trump procreation, which is ordered to marriage. Christ did not abolish marriage or disconnect procreation from marriage. For this reason, the church continues to name procreation, love, and protection from sin, the three goods of marriage. Even for the Roman Catholics, who elevated celibacy above marriage, have always affirmed that marriage and procreation are institutions of God, and therefore they are good. So perhaps we can make an opposite conclusion. As procreation continues to be a good of marriage, And if ART is a gift of God to achieve this good, then it appears that married Christians can use any means of ART to have children of their own. So looking at the doctrine of creation alone, we cannot be conclusive. We cannot tell whether Christians can use ART or not. All it tells us is that the Old Testament imperative to have children has been removed, but procreation is still good. So is there any other theological arguments we can consider? The Roman Catholic tradition offers one such argument. Their natural law theology puts much emphasis on the nature of things. As a result, they hold a very firm relationship between sex and procreation. The natural way to procreate is through sexual intercourse, and all acts of sexual intercourse are in turn related to procreation. Therefore, all forms of human interference in this natural process should be avoided. IVF and artificial insemination, even from husband, is deemed unnatural and thus immoral. Involvements of donor gametes or surrogate mothers are proscribed. The use of fertility drugs may be acceptable, but the danger of multiple pregnancies means that their use should be discouraged. So in short, for the Roman Catholics, the only way to have a baby is to have sex naturally. This natural law theology also proscribes the use of all forms of artificial contraception, as pregnancy is a natural outcome of sexual intercourse. The only form of birth control that is morally acceptable is abstinence, and perhaps the fertility cycle method. So this Roman Catholic view puts a necessary connection between sex and procreation. But Gilbert Meilaender is right to point out that although sex is related to procreation, they are not always and necessarily linked. In other words, not all acts of sexual intercourse are for the purpose of procreation. Sex is also ordered to love, and sexual intercourse is also an expression of love. Meilaender uses an analogy between food and sex to illustrate. He says that food is necessary for the survival of a person, but not all acts of eating are for one's survival. Frequently, we dine because we enjoy fellowship with others. And in the same way, sex is necessary for the perpetuation of the human species, but not all acts of sex aim at procreation. Frequently, we have sex because we love our partner. This argument correctly qualifies the linkage between sex and procreation, although it does not sever it completely. Contraception is then morally acceptable as long as the possibility of procreation is not excluded from the acts of love. And in the case of pregnancy, despite using contraceptives, the couple should still welcome the child as a gift of God. In the same way, the use of ART can be acceptable as long as love underlies the relationships between the couple and with the child.
Can we?
Yeah.
There's an entire piece that's being left out of this conversation.
Yeah.
And you're speaking about marriage entirely from a heteronormative sense.
Yep.
And on the day when, the same-sex marriage vote is up in Illinois, it's kind of frustrating.
Yeah, I understand.
You're also taking a biblical stance of marriage similar to like nowadays, but that's not what it looked like.
I understand.
And it's
the
very
concern.
problematic also.
I believe, to answer your question, is that I'm not claiming that this is normative, but if we are trying to think about procreation not in a sense of parenthood, I believe the natural sense is still. Otherwise, we have to approach the whole issue from a totally different angle.
Yeah.
Which is, and we can go the other way. We can go the other way, and definitely it's one of the other ways to do it. But I understand your concern, and it's. I believe if we have to open up the discussion to I believe for the same-sex marriage, the parenthood issue is in the adoption issue. It's not in this sense. Right? So,
It's adoption and surrogacy. I mean, when you're talking about,
yeah.
so that is very relevant to this conversation.
Which means we also have to talk about economics.
But the point that I get that you're making is you're outlining the traditional stance
Yes.
of the church
Right.
on this issue,
Yes.
specifically regarding creation.
Right.
Traditional marriage in the Bible didn't look like that, though. It didn't look like what it looks like now.
I don't think he's argued that at all.
No, I think he's trying to lay out.
He's giving
Yeah,
a
I'm not
descriptive
endorsing
of
anything.
tradition.
I'm spelling out the information. I'm not making
Laying
any.
out the argument, period.
Yeah. So,
It is what it is.
bear with me. And there is a whole different way of thinking about the whole
I'm
issue.
not on.
Yeah. So,
Can you just restate what you just said about marriage and parenthood? I was trying to write a note and I just couldn't. I didn't follow you well about the connection between marriage and parenthood.
I will talk about more about that. You mean I just talk about in the notes or I just?
Well, I don't know what in your lecture. I don't know whether you're saying that is it the purpose of marriage is to become parents, or is that?
No, let me say that. For the Old Testament, yes.
Oh,
Because of the procreation mandate to marry, well, you have to have children, otherwise, and even looking at the levirate marriage law in the Old Testament, having biological children, having heir, having descendants is even more important than the marriage order. So you can see in the law that a brother of that person, the brother of that person has to marry the widow and to give an heir to the deceased person. So, so what it's saying is that in the Old Testament time, procreation is really a mandate. You have to have children. Right. But in the New Testament time, because Jesus remains single, and in eschaton, we do not have marriage or child marriage anymore. So that's the eschatological witness is singleness. So for Christians, now we live in the middle of times. We have both ends to look at. We look at the Old Testament, the creation account, and we also look at the resurrection. And now, whether to marry or whether to have children becomes an option, or becomes a calling. Later on, I'll talk about that. So they become equal. So therefore, what I'm saying is that whether to have children, if we just look at the creation account, it does not tell us anything. We cannot make a definitive argument out of the creation account because it doesn't really matter now. It's both options. So parenthood does not entail, marriage does not entail parenthood right now. All right, so I'll just conclude.
So when you say marriage is not until parenthood,
Right, in New Testament time. So marriage is, what I mean is that for Christians, we can, later on I'll talk about marriage as a calling, but when God calls us to enter marriage, we marry, but it does not necessarily mean that all married couples must have children. So that's the qualification, because the procreation mandate is now abolished by Jesus.
I wouldn't argue that it's abolished because what Jesus said in regards to the afterlife and the fact that marriage is not in
Right.
what's been, but I think the point that he was making is that because he was answering a specific argument about divorce, and he was saying, as far as the kingdom is concerned, that's not the issue. But in addressing the issue that was at hand, he then came back and said there are those who are called to singleness.
Yes.
And that's a gift.
Yes.
And basically, it's like there are those that are married, and if you marry, what God has put together, let no one put asunder. And
Right,
he
right.
defined what that was.
Yes, also. And so what I'm seeing is that,
So Jesus is Lord, is not.
pardon me?
I said either Jesus is Lord and he sets the standard or he's not. But if he set the standard, reinforced the standard in the Old Testament. That means-
Yeah, he does. But definitely, Jesus is not creating something new out of the Old Testament. He highlights the creation account to affirm permanence of marriage has been in the Old Testament all along. But Jesus is really bringing it up, saying that what he says is that now marriage is not for procreation. Marriage shows the fidelity and the permanence of the covenant. Of the covenant. And also in the Revelations, we see that, or even in Ephesians, we see the marriage between Christ and church. That's a marriage. So marriage is still there, but it's not necessarily a man and a woman or two persons, right? So it's really, the image is still there. But what it shows is not who, but the permanence and the fidelity of the relationship. That is being
That's a
brought up.
compromise.
Yeah? Okay.
That's a compromise to the culture.
Yeah.
Because that's not what the text is.
Right. So I mean, it's an extension of it. So it's I think it's subject to the interpretation of all.
So are you saying that Jesus is taking away the traditional stance of marriage in the Old Testament? That's what I'm.
No, he's not. He's affirming it. So what I mean is that he's affirming the marriage image, but you know that in eschaton, marriage in the sense of today no longer exists. Because there will be no marriage, no person marrying or giving in marriage.
In
That's what
heaven,
he said.
when Jesus comes back.
When Jesus comes back
He
again.
has a millennial
Right.
reign, yes.
Right.
But now,
Now it's not abolished. So singleness and marriage becomes two equal witnesses. So Christians can choose to marry or not. So what? After Jesus comes, at this point in time in history, we can choose to marry or not. No, either one is okay. Paul also says the same thing in Corinthians chapter 7. Yeah. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He says the same thing. If you marry, you don't sin. But I encourage those who are not married, stay single. Of course, he's shaped by the eschatological expectation, but still, it remains an option. Okay. All right, so let me continue with it. We just discussed about the Catholic stand on it and Milanda's argument against it. All right, so let's go on to the other point. Another theological argument concerning the use of ART comes from Christology. The Nicene Creed states that the Son was begotten of the Father. Begotten, not made. The difference between begotten and made is that the same begets the same, and only a creator makes. The maker is different from the one being made. As fully God, Christ was begotten of the Father, who is also fully God. But God, our Creator, made us human beings. Oliver O'Donovan applies this notion to the parent-child relationship and argues that we beget our children. We do not make them. Only God, our Creator, makes us. If we beget our children, then they are the same as us, sharing equal dignity. They are simply entrusted to us by God for a time, so that they can grow as human beings whom God loves. In this respect, the phrase "our own children" can be problematic. We never own our children. They are entrusted to us for a time. Children are not projects to be mastered, but gifts to be received. From this perspective, O'Donovan argues that some forms of ART edge dangerously close to treating children as projects. The various technological possibilities that grow out of IVF, such as quality control of embryos, selection of human traits, etc., effectively view the children to be born as products made according to our will. Therefore, these technologies must be avoided. Perhaps the notion of begotten, not made, speaks to the heart of the moral debate. Modern technology, according to George Grant, is predicated upon the mastery of nature and human nature. As Christians, no matter what ART we use, we must beware of the temptation to master over ourselves and others. After all, moral issues concerning the beginning of life is the deliberation by the parents about their children. The decision is always made by the parents, but the impacts are on the children. Here, we are prone to think of children not as our equals, but as our creation. To think about ART is very similar to thinking about other technologies. We assume that we can use technology to benefit ourselves, but we are unaware that we have already been informed by the narrative of mastery in the techno culture. On the other hand, we cannot assume that ART is just like any other technology. While other technologies mostly deal with things or persons already exist, ART deals with bringing new lives into the world. With the procreation mandate now removed, Christians ought to be cautious, even conservative, in using ART for obtaining children of our own. So effectively what O'Donovan is saying is that for ART, the underlying assumption or the underlying motivation is that children can be a product, not to be a child, but to make the children. So subtly, the relationship between parents and children would be changed. So that O'Donovan's argument, why he is kind of conservative on this stand. One argument that supports the use of ART is that it can fulfill the desire of childless parents to have children of their own. As mentioned above, the desire for children is a part of human nature. But for Christians, our highest desire should always be for God. So when discussing marital issues in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul admonishes his fellow Corinthians to simply follow God's calling and assignment when they decide whether to marry, he says. However that may be, let each of you lead the life that the Lord has assigned, to which God called you. Based on this text, Karl Barth argues that marriage is a calling from God, requiring our obedient response. To decide whether to marry or to remain single is in fact to discern one's calling. And also, he would also argue that not only one calling, it's also a gift. Normally we think that singleness is a gift for everybody, but Barth argues that also marriage is a gift, because he argues that for permanent marriage, we need the gift of love to sustain the marriage. So that's his argument. And similarly, parenthood is also a calling, requiring discernment of each couple in their particular situation. Our desire is foremost for God, and we must place our other desires under God's particular command on each of us. Although Barth insists that God's commands are free and particular, he argues that they are not arbitrary. They always address our life situations and in accordance with God's covenantal relationship with humankind. Therefore, the discernment of the call to the parenthood and the use of ART must respect the dignity of each person and resist the technological temptation of mastery. So, aggressive forms of IVF, for example, that do not adequately respect the dignity of the unborn child is therefore unlikely to be commanded by God. As Christians, we are commanded to love. We do not always have to satisfy our own desires, even the desires are good. We are not called to always satisfy them. Christian love is agape, where the lover loves simply for the sake of the beloved. Agape love serves the other. On the other hand, desire is erotic love, where one loves another so that the need of oneself is fulfilled. Erotic love serves the self. So we cannot avoid to say that a childless couple desiring children of their own, no matter how natural and justifiable the desire is still erotic love. They want children so that their desire to become parents can be fulfilled. And of course, after their children are born, their love for them can become selfless and agape. But this does not annul the fact that their motivation to have children was out of a self-fulfilling erotic love in the first place. A couple who resorts to aggressive forms of ART is likely to act out of their desire for children. But the same cannot be said about couples wanting to have children through sexual intercourse. Sex is foremost an expression of love between two persons, demonstrating the ideal of permanence and fidelity in covenantal relationships. No matter how well planned a couple is, how intentional they are about conceiving a child, pregnancy through sexual intercourse cannot be mastered, and any child conceived is always a gift of God. If no child is conceived in an act of sexual intercourse, the act is not a failure. But the same cannot be said about IVF, whose success is only achieved by the production of an infant. Sex is ordered to love. One outcome of sexual love is procreation, but this is not a necessary outcome. But IVF is ordered necessarily to reproduction, and is thus governed by the desire and will of the parents. So as Christians are commanded to love only for the sake of the beloved. The use of aggressive ART that grows out of one's desire for children should be avoided. So if we think more about why childless couples want to use ART, this can become a little problematic and it can become difficult. But when we think clearly, we cannot avoid drawing the conclusion that it's out of the desire. And of course, we can argue that for a childless couple, for a couple who want children, they have sexual intercourse to desire children. That's the same desire. But when we come to think of having natural sex to have children, the couple always know that the child conceived is still a gift of God. It's not mastery. So there's a subtle difference between the two. Although the desire can share. I mean, the desire for children is always good. I'm not saying the desire for children is not a good thing. But using ART still, there's still a little bit different from just natural kind of thing.
So are you saying that the use of ART, if that produces a child, that the couple may not recognize that child is a gift from God?
No, I'm not saying that. I think it's always a degree and a gray area. It's not definitive, but the tendency.
But the tendency is the tendency to not give God the credit, if you will. I don't know, for that child being born.
You can say something like that, but of course we have to recognize that technology is also a gift of God.
Right.
We can always argue
And I
with
understand that, but I guess I'm just trying to understand what you're saying with regards to the couple. Is there a concern that the couples may forget that the technology is a gift from God, therefore the fact that they now have this child is a gift from God? That's all I'm saying.
So it's not definitive at all. I mean, we cannot draw any definitive conclusion. But when we think about the issue, or think about it in terms of technology, then we attempt to say that say for fertility drug, I don't think it's really a problem. But if one really has to go all the way, trying a lot of times for that, and spending a lot of money and time on that, and damaging the body and things like that, then we have to suspect what's going on. Is it really the gift of God they're expecting? What if God doesn't want to give them the gift? Do they allow it? So it's really a gray area, and really a discernment and pastoral concern that we are facing. So so in conclusion, this is what if we do some thinking and on the issue of parenthood, and I have to mention that this is particularly the more traditional way of thinking about that, and also to look at it through the natural process of parenthood, which is like a man and a woman coming together to have biological children. So that's the lens through which I address the issue. A quick conclusion on what I've talked about is that parenthood is really a calling, and it's a command from God. And so it requires discernment of each particular couple. We cannot make a definitive, conclusion. Yes, you can use it. No, we cannot use it. And draw a hard boundary along the line. It's really a discernment of each particular couple. And we do not need to reject all forms of ART, but we must think through the implications of each technology. What does it do to me? What does it do to the children to be born? How does it affect our relationship, affect the relationship between community, our view of technology, things like that. And we're also seeing that biology does not dictate our moral thinking, but biology is not unimportant at the same time. So the relationship between our body and procreation, although they are not necessarily linked, but those may not be severed totally. So similarly, the relationship between sex, love, and procreation, in the church tradition, always hold them together. How far are we willing to separate them? That's the issue we have to address. We have to concern ourselves about. And so perhaps we must be cautious about the ability of ART to master over human nature, as mastery is the language of our technoculture. And also I think the most powerful argument we have is O'Donovan's idea of begetting and making, right? We beget our children, we do not make our children. So to think of children as made and not begotten is to turn children into projects and procreation into reproduction. So the two terms are very similar, but they come out with different meaning, procreation and reproduction. And also parents into creators, not really parents. So I guess, back to the whole problem of ART, it's really a technology. And so embedded in the technology is the teleculture and the mastery. It may not be, we do not have to say that technology is bad, we use it all the time. But it's just something we have to be careful about. Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering if we're concerned about participating in technology and the agenda of mastery that it has, what is the difference between contraception as mastery versus ART as mastery?
Yeah. So they are very closely linked, as seen in the Roman Catholic tradition. Roman Catholic goes the extreme way. They draw a necessary, relationship between natural sex and natural conception, natural procreation. So, if we argue that no, they are not necessarily linked. On the one hand, we can accept the morality of contraception, and on the other hand, we can accept the morality of ART. And so, of course, ART is not one thing. It's a big spectrum of argument. So you're right. It's not. So therefore, if we embrace the same logic, ART and contraception are very similar. One is avoiding, the other is allowing. So yeah, so it's really the cutoff line in each particular case, how far you want to go. And the thing is that if we say that if we still want to maintain the linkage between sex and procreation, then there is always a chance for sex to lead to procreation. So that if we maintain a little bit, however little we would want to maintain it. So the result is that whenever we engage in the sex act, we cannot, if there is any child conceived, we have to welcome the child. So I think that's also one way of thinking about the issue. No, I'm not arguing, abortion is absolutely wrong. But, when we think of the linkage, we see all the linkages.
You mentioned creation and Christology. Say from a Trinitarian perspective, when you think about the language of ousia, sameness, of the same substance, when you begin to think about other relationships, how within the Trinitarian construct could such relations be advocated by the church, when you try to step beyond the boundaries of, say, traditional ways of thinking about marriage or relationships?
Well, I guess the Trinitarian theology can be useful, but it can also be negative. So we have to be careful how we use it, because Father, Son, so there's the hierarchy and things like that can be problematic at the same time. But I think for Trinitarian theology, it simply affirms that we are persons in relation. That's the first thing we have to affirm, because God is Trinitarian. So we carry over the relational aspect from God, and we want to be relational. So in Christology, O'Donovan makes use of the begotten, the sameness between Father and Son, to say that our relationship between parents and children are very similar. And I think he's right on that.
But could you also use that, the notion of sameness for the promotion of, say, same-sex relations? The Son is of the same substance of the Father, so within the Trinity you have a similarity as well as difference.
Of course, the Son and Father is a language thing.
Right.
A lot of theologians want to get away from the language, like don't call God the Father or the Son or something like that. But because we cannot assign sex to God, it's a language cultural thing, it's so complicated, the issue.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the notion of sameness, that the Son, in that the Son is begotten of the unbegotten one, that one is begotten of the same substance.
Right.
So, and there's this mutuality, this indwelling interrelatedness of sameness between the Father, Son, and Spirit.
So I think in Trinitarian theology, the useful thing is that they are ontological, or their being is the same, but they are still different.
True.
I think that's the beauty of Trinitarian theology. We can have difference in relationship and difference sharing the same ontology. So I think it's the parent-child relationship also. We are always equal in dignity. But of course, when a child, when the child is really young, as an infant, of course they're not totally equal in all aspects. But still, we still have to look at them as being equal in ontology. And that's why, the beginning of life issue is very interesting in the sense that all the decisions are concerned with the children, but the children are not making the decision. So being parents and adults, we have to be extra careful about it. Yes, that's the good point.
Are there thoughts on how IVF, the result or the effect of actually having a child or being pregnant, that could be looked at as the gift versus the product? Because, if you're saying that not all possibilities of sex produces a child, right? Not all
Yeah.
experiences with IVF is it, because it's really hard for me to digest
Yes.
that, you know, in order for a child to be begotten, it has to be through procreation.
No, I don't think, I think you're
I'm not
right.
saying you are arguing that, I'm just trying to hear it.
Yeah, so I think there are like a whole spectrum of arguments. It's the most conservative, the Roman Catholic stand, or the most open stand, saying and thinking that, well, all ART is it's a gift of God, so we can use whatever we want. I think it's a matter of degree, and it's a matter of discernment, and also it's a matter of, moral deliberation has to be done among the community, between husband and among the couple, among the friends, among the church tradition, and also, and if it's a matter of calling, then calling does not come arbitrarily, right? So, we can always think that, a couple, they sense a calling from God to have children. They feel such a strong sense of calling to be parents that they want to use their ART. Then, as their pastor, just discern with them and pray with them, see what options are available. But ultimately, we also have to allow the possibility that, and not even succeeding say for fertility drug. A couple may feel that, we can use fertility drug, but nothing beyond, all right? So if they cannot conceive a child with fertility drug, they will just take it as a calling of the will of God, and that's fine. It's really depending on the couple itself.
I want to bring something in this conversation on a real sense of how I live in my life as a woman in ministry, called to God, seeking to live my life to be good. So I am bought with the price of the precious blood of Christ, so my life is not my own. Now I'm single, over 40, never married, no children. Now in my plan, in my design, I would have been married at 25, done having children by 32, and riding off into the sunset with my husband. That hasn't happened. So do I go and create my own world and step out of what might be God's will and plan to do that? Or do I submit myself to His plan and His sovereignty, trusting in His plan for my life? And knowing that He knows what's best for me.
Well,
and I do that. His perfect will is done and not mine.
Well, I guess you're asking a question much bigger than what you
No, and I see that as an example of a lot of what we talk about. We say we're Christians. We say we love Jesus Christ. We say we want to live for Him. But that requires salvation is He paid the price for our salvation. But there's a price that we pay too as people who are called to ministry. And if our lives are not our own, and I think Paul set that example himself in what he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and providing biblical, what later will become biblical guidance between singleness versus marriage. And then, because marriage is a call. Marriage is not something that you do just because you erotically love each other and you want to, he did say yes, better than marrying than burn. But when you're purposeful in marriage, and knowing that two people are joining together for a kingdom assignment, and you don't just arbitrarily pick somebody just because.
Yeah.
And so, and again, I say that within the framework of what, how, as leaders, then how are we to advise people if we don't have that straight ourselves?
I guess as pastor you have to really make up your mind. But I don't need to do that here. But this is distant. I think what I've done is some way of thinking about people. But still, each of you has to make up your own mind. And of course, I would believe it would depend a lot on the community you're working with. And of course, your own background and your thinking and how the couple reacts to the whole issue, it comes into the equation. And definitely. but it does not annul the fact that we have to think through the issue theologically. So. So any other questions or any unknown?
Just as a resource, I'm curious, as the concept of fidelity has kind of been looked at and picked apart within modernity as things have changed. Like I'm familiar with like the work that Bertrand Russell did when he was dealing with like monogamy and fidelity and how those things are the same and how they're different. Are there any kind of Christian ethicists out there right now that are really kind of looking at what fidelity might mean, how that might include or might not include concepts like monogamy or things that would consider traditional marriage, how technology and these medical things are kind of coming in to talk about what it means to be faithful to between two partners and to God. Just if you could just throw out a couple names that I can jot down.
Yeah, I mean, I think as far back, even from a relatively conservative source, Lewis Smedes at Fuller wrote back in, the title of the book is Sex for Christians, I believe. And this would have been, I don't remember when it was published, someone can pull it up.
I know which book you're talking about, I'm trying.
And in there he argues that there needs to be some sort of covenant relationship for same-sex couples. So that you have strands that are looking at fidelity and covenant relationships. The political debate has been dominated by the concept of marriage, perhaps not to the best use of what is really at stake.
Relationality and
right, and so it may be the case that the state ought not endorse marriage one way or the other for anybody. Right, but that's not a conversation that we can have because that actually requires some truthfulness and some more difficult conversation, rather than clinging to an ideology on either side. And there are, active gays and lesbians who would argue they don't want to be honorary heterosexuals.
Exactly.
And so using the language of marriage as a way to be, quote, included, but that doesn't negate the reality that there is goods, external goods, attached
state
to
benefits, rights,
right. No,
actual,
that's exactly so I prefer the language of goods, mostly because I think the language of rights gets us into pretty murky waters pretty quickly, particularly from a Christian moral theology perspective. But there are external goods to the relationships that are attached by legal protection that are not extended to folks, and it's inconceivable to me that there are people who think that's good. Regardless of what one thinks of a relationship, I think one has to at least recognize that there are human persons in that relationship. And so there are rather conservative folks and I think Lewis Smedes would be a good source to start from, who begin to think about it in covenant terms, who is an evangelical. I don't know anyone that would be right of that position. I mean, right, you start to get into, once you go sort of past that, you start to lose the ability to talk about empirical reality. And you have to sort of put things and people and into categories that are not necessarily helpful.
Yeah, and even just having discussions about like the concept of what does fidelity mean with people that are going to be getting married.
Mm-hmm. No,
with friends that are kind of seeking those things out. There's kind of like this set of morals that we can accept and block. But because we kind of just take them and accept them, we haven't really taken the time to sit down and consider what they mean between us. And that can, part of the role of the pastor at that point is to encourage that conversation, and it might mean to pick apart some things that we have just taken for granted as this is the moral right, or this is the way it's been done, this is how my parents did it, my grandparents did it, so on and so forth, when our reality and the things that we will be tested and challenged on are going to be very different.
But I'm simply looking at the number of affairs that have increased, and that's simply a byproduct of women in the workplace, right? Because men and women are more
And travel, our ability to travel. I mean, like,
Right.
you couldn't leave your village before. You knew the 50 people that you
Well, I mean, not
met.
even the village, but even as recent as the 1950s, right? There was a very particular amongst middle class and upper middle class role for the wife. When that dissolves, arguably for the better, that a couple and individuals can navigate those choices for themselves, that just produces more opportunities.
Yeah. So how do we handle? I mean, that's a reality.
I think it's part of actively having these conversations and actively preaching on relationships, not in the 3-point bullet, here's Mark Driscoll's ways to have a successful marriage, not to name drop or anything, but I mean, the goal, I think, of this class is to help you all think about these issues from a fullest perspective. I think Dr. Waters has very clear positions. I mean, he's actually a pretty prolific author, having only been a PhD for about 14 years. If that, I mean, he did his PhD late in his 40s. So his positions are quite clear, but if you notice, I think in his method, he's actually rather broad.
He's brought in a lot of other voices that were not his own. That's always appreciated.
No, for sure, and but the goal of the class is not to suggest that there is a right Christian answer, right? You will never hear him say this is the Christian answer, but his goal is always to be raising more questions, right? What are the kinds of questions we have to be thinking about? And, right, I mean, Michael, you are quite correct. When you're talking about gay and lesbian couples, transgender couples, whatever the case may be, non-heteronormative experience, surrogacy, right, is an open question. But are there limits that we want to place on surrogacy because it is an exploitive practice, right? And I think the answer to that is probably yes.
Yes, and I wholeheartedly agree.
But it's not until we can begin to think about, sort of the parameters around which, but you can't open the fire hose and answer everything at one point.
That's right.
Right? You have to begin to think about it somehow, and that doesn't mean that it's being excluded or ignored or pushed aside, though it can feel like that at times. It is the case that you have to be able to tackle questions as they come up. And so so surrogacy in its various forms, or IVF, is only a result and would only be available to a gay or lesbian couple because of modern technology. So unless we can formulate something against which the sort of biological reproduction occurs, then it's difficult to begin to think about these other experiences without having an adequate framework to begin with.
I think that framework, too, depends so much on your context and where you're coming from. We have different ways, is it about a marriage, or is it about a particular kind of relationship that's covenanted and bonded, and how that relationship not only works between two people, but also with God, and how that will come in and comment on these issues? Or is it about a particular institution that has changed over time and looks particular ways, and then finding out what people mean when they say marriage, and which institution of which time they're dealing with, and then and then link that back into that covenant and relationship to come in and talk. And so I think it makes the conversation even extra more difficult, because you're bringing in some factors then that
Yeah, and I guess because the question came up when you first started talking about, is it possible to love more than one person? I think it's a question that must be grappled with. I mean, just the fact that there are societies or groups of persons who...
polyamory is a real thing.
Right.
And it's a healthy thing in some
there
cases.
are
and
American
contexts.
Christians that are polyamorous, and they're writing and they're doing work, and we have spent a very good amount of time ignoring that.
And just as well as there are persons who have same-sex relationships who, in their states, are not, where marriage is not recognized for them, it's the same for those persons who are in this relationship. So I wonder whether or not we just choose not to discuss something and just say that this is the standard because we're afraid to just realize that there's not always going to be a black and white.
I think part of it is that change happens in small increments, and I think historically when we look at the kind of, shall we say, Hebrew scripture mindset of marriage that was often very plural and very property oriented, and then the shift from that into the New Testament model of two-person monogamous relationships that was really kind of set up as a means of being countercultural at least from my understanding. If I'm speaking out of turn here, let me know. And I think what's happening today is that we're seeing almost a reverse shift. I mean, I have a number of friends. I mean, and I think your question of is it possible to love more than one person is important. But I think kind of the partner question to that is it healthy?
Yeah.
Because I will speak from experience here. When you bring more than two people into a relationship,
It's hard.
it's hard.
Yep.
But even
I mean,
if
there's
you
work
want
for
to
that.
advocate polyamorous relationship, how would you, from a Christian standpoint, begin to?
I think anyone who says that there's one Christian model for marriage is lying out their ass.
Yeah, and I think it's relationality, like
So how do you
covenant,
go about
honesty.
laying that out?
I mean, and that's the question, I think. And
I mean, I think
about, like, can we have a conversation about what's healthy?
I mean, I think when the thing about, as we look at scripture and its understanding, and I realize that was rude of me, I'm sorry. It's been a long week. When we look at biblical understanding of relationships and the notion of covenantal relationships, the fact is we see plenty of examples of relationships between one person and God, one person and one other person, two people in God, a full people in God. I mean, it's possible to have covenants that exist outside of just two people. The thing is, every time you bring another person in, it takes renegotiation, and it takes honesty and authenticity and trust.
No, I agree with all of that. I'm just asking if you want to push on that type of relationality, then, what's your point of departure? How do you
That's a great question.
begin to lay the foundation and say, within a Christian
context, how can we start to see this as right?
Yeah, I mean, I had a young woman go into my church and be like, I'm polyamorous, so how do I deal with that as a clergy person? That's a fair question.
Yeah.
The first thing I did is I got really scared and nervous and sweated a lot and prayed really quietly to myself of, oh God, please help me here. She had left the church and had not been welcomed back. She was from a conservative Methodist church down south. And so in that case, there was a big amount of individual pastoral care that was needed. First of all, to say, you can be part of the body, you can be a loved child of God. And from that point, I definitely will come from a particular kind of stance, but it was one of embrace and welcome, and that this particular house of faith, that you are welcome here, and that this is a safe place for you.
Yeah, I get all of that. I get all
So-
of that.
Let me try.
I'm just saying, where do you go from there? I agree with all of
You're
that.
asking about theology, not pastoral care.
Yeah, I'm asking.
I
how would you
think
begin to lay-
theologically, I would start from my personal understanding that the span of human diversity in terms of how different we are, in terms of our makeup, in terms of how we relate, I think is as diverse as God is. I think that when we understand that God can't be boxed in, that there's.
So the human creature can't be boxed in, so we have.
I think that we are capable of growth and change and transformation as far as God is capable of being creative.
Because I think this is, he's laying out with the creation, within the creation context. You see that the human creature has finite freedom. We don't have infinite freedom. We have
But there's,
finite
I
freedom.
think,
So
and I would agree, we have
it's like,
finite
we keep
freedom.
pushing the envelope, push the envelope, keep pushing the envelope.
I know,
et cetera, et
but
cetera.
But
Crazy.
I find a difference between freedom and capacity. That there's, yeah, we may have finite freedom, and I think that limitations can be a good thing.
When does it stop?
I mean, it didn't stop when the Gentiles got let in, and it didn't stop when we started, acknowledging women. I don't know where it stops. And I think that,
It doesn't.
I think that, part of that is being in a relationship with God and in community. The church moves together. We don't
So where?
jump ahead.
So to rephrase her question in a theological language, what the hell happens to sin?
That's a great
And where does, not where does it stop as in anything goes, but by what criteria do you say, no, this is not good?
So we don't advocate a pure society anymore. We don't teach on sin anymore. We avoid sin and we teach on everything else that is contrary to what we say to be true as Christians. So we want to promote something that is different than what we are reading, but at the same time give legitimacy to it. I don't understand. But maybe.